Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've admired you from afar and been curious about what goes on here at Torrey and at Biola more generally, and now I've had a chance to see face to face. And it's terrific. I'm just full of admiration for this institution. And I especially appreciate its insistence that the cultivation of human excellences, including intellectual and moral virtues, ought to be at the center of Christian education, and I commend you for that. I need hardly say that not all Christians share this view. Some of us, some of our brothers and sisters in Christ, distrust the intellectual life and fear that leaning too much on our own understanding will lead inexorably to the loss of our faith. I don't think such fears are entirely unfounded, and I don't make light of those who feel such fears, particularly when the concerns involve the fate of their own children. Too much about the culture of American higher education seems to be explicitly and even proudly aimed at precisely the results that those parents and others fear. But it is a hard truth of life, one that even the best and wisest parents don't like to hear, that their children will never be able to possess fully a faith that they've never allowed to be placed at risk. And I do not believe that the patient and disciplined pursuit of proven human excellences, such as goes on here, particularly when such talents are honed and developed with humility, with a view towards the glorification of God, I don't think that these things should be seen quite so controversially as they are in some Christian circles, particularly when we have before us superlative examples, such as the great English scholar and storyteller C.S. Lewis, whose fertile mind and matchless pen commanded the world of scholarship, apologetics, and imaginative literature with unequaled skill and panache. If he could beat the infidels at their own game, perhaps we can too. In fact, there's a historical irony at work here. At a time when so much of the secular educational world, transfixed by the spell of postmodernism and identity politics, seems to have abandoned the idea that higher education involves the orientation of our lives to higher things, to the pursuit of excellences grounded in definable and enduring human nature. At such a time, institutions like the Torrey Honors Program, Biola, Baylor University, and a few others provide a haven for the high and disinterested ideals that used to be at the animating center of academic inquiry, but that so much of the modern academy has abandoned and even come to disdain. Just as the monks of the early Middle Ages faithfully preserved the Greek and Latin masterpieces that formed the basis of Western civilization, treasures that would have been lost at the collapse of the Roman Empire. So today, institutions that were founded initially as expressions of a culturally defensive Protestant fundamentalism may turn out to play a key role in the preservation of the West's greatest cultural achievements. What an interesting turn of events. God's ways may not be our ways, but we certainly can appreciate his sense of humor. It should be acknowledged, too, that the normative conception of virtue may be making a comeback, at least in the discipline of philosophy, which has experienced what many call an arete turn. Arete, of course, being the Greek word for virtue. Virtue ethics is offered as a vibrant alternative to the somewhat sterile alternatives of deontological and consequentialist moral reasoning. It may not be too much to hope for a general recovery of the idea of virtue and a belief in the necessity of cultivating virtue for the flourishing of the human person as guiding normative principles in our ways of thinking about questions of truth and the good life. One of the benefits of a revival of virtue ethics is that it can provide us with a high and demanding standard of behavior that both believers and non-believers can agree upon. And yet, if such a recovery comes, it will have owed much of its impetus to Christian thinkers, such as Elizabeth Anscombe, Stanley Hauerwas, and Alistair MacIntyre, who rescued the concept of virtue from the shadows and put it back into the light and back into play. Virtue is not a substitute for the Christian life, but it can be an excellent preparation for it. When I think of the role of virtue in the Christian life, I immediately think of a great and justly famous passage from Paul's epistle to the Philippians. You all know it, but I think it's worth quoting the entire passage. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. That's Philippians 4:8. When I was a teenager some 4 decades ago, this sort of statement would have been regarded as a platitude, the sort of thing that everyone believed, but regarded as too tiresome and obvious and gassy to need to be stated. Well, of course. But today, in the age of Lena Dunham, Paul's words sound almost avant-garde, a crisp, clear, clean rebuke to our slack and jaded era in which we waste an inordinate amount of time salivating over the lives and looks of vacuous celebrities and watching inane reality television shows whose shameless participants make fools of themselves and of us for watching. We may soon come to the point, we may already be there, where old-fashioned wholesomeness is the most radical and countercultural posture of all, particularly if it makes us able to say no to the corruptions of our popular culture and instead resolve to stake our lives on something more solid and more lasting. And indeed, at the time when Paul wrote, his words were radical and countercultural. Radical in the sense of something that goes to the root. These are words that recall us to ourselves. There is a genuine philosophy of education embedded in these words from Philippians that I've quoted. And it's very much at odds with the prevailing de facto view these days of many parents, educators, writers, television producers, and kids. The prevailing sentiment takes the position that no one can really know for sure what's true, pure, or just. That's a strictly individual judgment, and it would therefore be an arrogant imposition of one's values or tastes to assume otherwise. Therefore, the only really fair and honest way to educate young people is to expose them to many things as possible. Respect their feelings. Remain as genially non-judgmental as possible, and leave it to them to sort things out. It is a modest approach to education that appears on the surface to be genuinely generous and liberatory, but it is in fact far from being either one. For it's an approach whose liberality is really only a veil for its lack of conviction and for its indifference to the fate of the very ones consigned to its care. Not indifference to their physical fate, of which we are perhaps now excessively solicitous with our growing mania for physical health and safety and our nannying horror of all risk, but indifference to their intellectual and spiritual fates, about which nonchalance is the approved position, an attitude of chilled out neutrality, which is in fact an attitude of abdication. Paul's words show a better way. They assume, to begin with, that there is such a thing as virtue, and that virtue is praiseworthy, and that the fundamental channels of education are mimetic, that meaning to say they involve us in learning by imitation, a process in which the choice of admirable examples to be imitated is all important. Deep calls unto deep. Refinement begets refinement. High ideals call forth high ideals. Noble deeds leave a deposit of noble character. We become the things we contemplate. At the same time, a steady diet of triviality, mediocrity, baseness, and propaganda in education has a different effect and leaves us far less than what we could have been. We should remember this in our leisure hours. Those things we choose as exemplary become, in the end, a window onto what we believe that it means to be most fully human. The belief that's at the bottom of all other subjects and pursuits in a real education. And to be most fully human is always to aspire to be something more than what we are, to aspire to overcome ourselves, improve ourselves, ennoble ourselves, by holding before ourselves images of high achievement and admirable character to which we compare ourselves and hold ourselves accountable. No one thought more deeply about these things than Aristotle, and he offered an unforgettable statement of this very theme in the 10th book of his Nicomachean Ethics. And I quote, "We must not follow those who advise us, being men, to think of human things, and being mortal, of mortal things. But we must, so far as we can, make ourselves immortal and strain every nerve to live in accordance with the best thing in us. For even if it be small in bulk, much more in power and in worth does it surpass everything. This would seem, too, to be each man himself, since it is the authoritative and better part of him. It would be strange if he were to choose not the life of his self, but that of something else." I'll return to this passage a little bit later, but for now let me observe that it tells us that education should aspire to two things. First, it should point us towards self-mastery, a condition in which we come into full possession of ourselves, overcoming the tyranny of our appetites and the even greater tyranny of the immediate with all its nagging and imperious demands. Instead, give us the capacity to fix our eyes and desires upon the goals that matter, the things that endure. Second, according to Aristotle, education should make us eager to realize the fullest possibilities of our humanity, our fullest flourishing, which means striving always to transcend the merely human, those foibles and follies to which we are all prone, and instead to inspire us to hear and heed the call of higher things. And to quote Aristotle again, to strain every nerve to live in accordance with the best thing in us. It is, of course, human to err and stumble and to be pushed along by forces beyond our control. But it is even more human to strive in the teeth of such challenges, to refuse a life lived as a tumbleweed of unregulated desires, and instead to live a life of unity, integrity, principle, and purpose, a life informed by the directive power of large and generous ideals, a life, in short, of virtue. This, I repeat, is not the only philosophy of education on offer in contemporary America. It's not even the dominant one. Instead, training in self-esteem, group dynamics, adjustment, social usefulness, vocational skills, money-making, test-taking, or global citizenship. All are cited as the most reasonable goals of education. And make no mistake, some of these are very worthy things indeed. But none is on the same level as the goal of calling us into full possession of ourselves and of our full humanity. By that standard, all these other goals seem timid and useless, notwithstanding their panting eagerness to be useful. There are some deep paradoxes at the heart of education. In the first place, it's most useful when it does not consciously strive to be useful. And secondly, it's an unending task because it engages us in seeking to become more fully what we already are, or rather, to become what we are meant to be, fulfilling some potentiality that's already inherent in what we are. Not that we're necessarily meant to be some particular thing, an architect, a doctor, a welder, whatever. That's not what I mean. Instead, I mean that the fullest measure of our humanity is something not merely given to us, it's something we strive to appropriate, to make our own. It is an achievement building on an endowment. We have a great and goodly inheritance, yes, but our own efforts are needed to make it fully our own. This is characteristic of all the virtues. They're products of our labors. And yet they're not acts of self-invention so much as they are acts of self-realization. So, why, you are wondering, have I chosen the title for my talk, 2 Cheers for Virtue? Why am I so ungenerous as to give virtue only 2 cheers? Where's the downside? What am I leaving out? Well, first I would stress my 2 cheers are very heartfelt, even enthusiastic. They might even be extended to 2 3/4 cheers if it were possible to give a partial cheer. The recovery of the concept of virtue is hugely welcome, and it's essential as a blow against some of the most pernicious forces in our culture, particularly our bland relativism and our detachment from any and all ideas that we have a human nature that's more than a figure of speech. To speak of virtue is to speak of human excellence, arete, the specific excellence of a particular thing inherent in that thing's nature. It is to affirm the reality and the goodness of the created order and our reverence for the beauty, commodity, and complexity of that order as God meant it to be. If we believe in something called human nature, we're also likely to believe that the point of living well is to live in harmony with that order, not in rebellion against it, or in some self-creation of Nietzschean fantasy erected against the blank backdrop of nihilism. It means believing in the possibility of our being, in some sense, at home in the universe. And the concept of virtue, as I've already suggested, provides us with desperately needed moral common ground in our culture between those of us who are religious and those of us who are not. Even if religious people and secular people of goodwill disagree about the nature of ultimate reality and our relationship to it, we can, with the help of the concept of virtue, still find common ways to speak of moral decisions and to agree on shared values that we can teach our children. Secular people can accept, as Aristotle did, the idea of natural law as an ordering principle that can orient us in wholesome and fruitful ways towards human excellences such as honesty, courage, loyalty, mutual respect, and love. Once again, C.S. Lewis is a great example of how the world of secular learning and the world of religious faith are not only compatible, but essential to one another. They flourish together, and they languish apart from one another. We all can rally around the idea that education should be about building character, helping to mold young people of conviction who have a habituation to virtue. All this is true. but it doesn't alter my determination to offer 2 cheers rather than 3. For I wish to argue there's something important missing from the concept of virtue, something essential to the Christian insight into human existence, and that something is easily stated. It is the experience of our brokenness and inadequacy, our lack of any kind of excellence in our own right, as the most fundamental feature of our human condition and the starting place for the rebuilding of ourselves as followers of Christ. When does the Christian life as a serious and whole-souled proposition begin? It doesn't begin at the moment when your moral education is completed, your habituation to virtue has been fully grounded, when you are all, so to speak, dressed up, fully catechized, all salted up and ready to step out into the world. No, the Christian life as a serious moral proposition begins at the moment in which you realize you've committed in your life some act or acts for which you can never be forgiven and for which you cannot effect a reversal. You cannot walk back or otherwise undo. The moment when you realize, as the British say, that you've blotted your copybook, leaving an ink stain that no cleanser or solvent on earth can cover up or remove. The acts can be small and inadvertent. They can be horrendous, crimes and betrayals of a high order of magnitude. They can be wayward thoughts, transgressive daydreams, wish fulfillments. They can be almost anything. But the awareness of our grievous faults is not a one-time thing. It not only continues, but grows and grows as we become more self-aware. As an Episcopal priest friend of mine once explained it to me, quote, "As I grow in the Christian life, I feel more and more keenly the need of confession in my life." Is the growing conviction of our propensity for sin, something we generally hide from our others and from ourselves in the great enabling fog that shields us from the stabs of our self-awareness as we make our way in this busy, easily distracted world. It is this growing awareness of our sinfulness that propels us forward in the Christian life, not the momentum created by our growth in virtue. And what does the word forward actually mean in my preceding sentence? It is possible that we become better people along the way, but we will be the last to know about it, aren't we? Even the virtue of humility, which is a kind of virtue, although Aristotle would not have recognized it as a virtue. Even the virtue of humility is a very peculiar virtue, since the more we possess it, the more unwilling we should be to take pride in it. For taking pride in your humility is to undo the virtue even in the act of acknowledging it. All the other virtues as forms of human excellence are the sorts of qualities one can take pride in without committing the sin of spiritual pride. Not so humility. One can define it in various ways, and the differences among these definitions are important. The humility of the ancient Greeks, who feared that excessive pride, hubris, would attract the savage vengeance of the inscrutable and remorseless gods. This was something quite distinct from the humility of the Jews, who not only feared their God, but loved him for his attributes of justice and graciousness, or that of the Christians, who added to Judaism's ethical monotheism the astounding belief that humility is inherent in the very nature of God himself. This contention expressed, of course, most vividly in the person of Jesus Christ, who emptied himself of all the trappings of divine majesty and chose to endure earthly humiliation at the hands of cruel and unjust men for the sake of his great mission of redemption and his sacrificial love for a wayward humanity. To be humble is to accept one's fundamental lowliness and powerlessness, one's inadequacy and dependency, and the fact of one's ultimate origins in the earth, in the humus. The word humble coming from that word. From dust we came, and to dust we shall return, the Ash Wednesday invocation. Such is the insight out of which a humble outlook and demeanor emerge. So humility is a very peculiar kind of virtue. For one thing, it requires for its realization that we constantly do battle with and insistently defeat some of our strongest and deepest inclinations. That requirement would appear to run athwart the usual assumption that human virtues are forms of excellence, which express the full flourishing of human nature. The great cardinal virtues, justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude, these are all clearly of that variety, refinements and intensifications of quality of character that arise in reasonably well-reared individuals and are clearly complementary to their natural endowments. Not so humility, which sets itself against many of our fundamental impulses, clips our wings, and negates our desires, working, in a sense, against nature itself, which may be precisely why Aristotle declined to regard humility as a virtue, and instead exalted greatness of soul, megalosouchia, as a convergence of the moral virtues, a mean, as all the virtues are for Aristotle, means between extremes, in this case, a mean between the extremes of vanity and pusillanimity. Whatever else one might say about the megalosouchos, the great-souled man, he was not humble. It's not for nothing that the word humility is so close to the word humiliation. Humility may require of us acts of passivity or self-limitation in response to even the basest affronts that may border on being degrading or shameful, acts to which the most natural reaction of, as we might put it, any self-respecting person would be to fight back and feel entirely justified in doing so. Who can read the story of Jesus' arrest, trial, and crucifixion and not feel the impulse to ask, why his utter passivity? Why doesn't he escape? Why doesn't he use his divine powers? Why doesn't he so much as lift a finger to defend himself? There is a magnificence in Jesus' selfless obedience, but it is also terrifying, and it should be. The natural person in us cries out in amazement and horror at the sight of a humility that goes beyond all bounds and defies our comprehension, willing to be the sheep led to the slaughter. There's an additional peculiarity to humility. It is a virtue that's constantly in danger of subverting itself and turning into its own opposite. As a result, what appears to be humility may very easily become something radically different from humility. This paradox is easily explained. As we become more accomplished in something, we tend to take pride in our advances and see our growing mastery, particularly when accompanied by the pleasure and approval of others, as a spur to further improvements. A pianist likes to show off her skill in playing a Beethoven sonata. An apprentice cabinet maker feels quiet satisfaction in the work of his hands. A dancer delights in knowing the pleasure her movements bring to others. But humility is by definition a virtue which systematically denies us these satisfactions. It is the virtue in which we should never take pride, whether that pride is generated entirely by ourselves or fed by the approval of others. Indeed, one could argue that the more deeply we commit ourselves to a way of thinking and being that accords with the standard of humility, the greater the danger is that we'll succumb precisely to the vice of pride, and particularly that insidious variety called spiritual pride, against which the virtue of humility struggles continuously. Such a conundrum has its comic side, best expressed in what I call the Mac Davis syndrome. Some of you old enough to remember a song from the 1980s by Mac Davis, a country singer, called, "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way." The line is great and funny because it's rooted in the truth about the peculiarly insufferable quality of a certain kind of self-satisfied, humble person. But the joke is on us. Every improvement we make in ourselves pursuing the virtue of humility also presents us with the danger that in recognizing it as an improvement and giving ourselves credit for that, we will begin to see ourselves as better than we are. And gradually, imperceptibly, but surely, we will begin to be proud of nothing so much as our ever more perfect humility. Then it really will be hard to be humble. Think by way of comparison of more uncomplicated, more natural virtues, such as courage or fortitude or faith. The more one possesses such a virtue, the more credible is one's possession of it in the eyes of others. The man who does increasingly courageous things is more and more evidently a courageous man. And the more he grows in the possession of courage and in the manifestation of it, the more confidently he can be identified and can identify himself as a man rooted in the virtue of courage. He doesn't detract from his courageousness by acknowledging it, nor does he enhance it by refusing to accept accolades, medals, and the like. He doesn't run the risk of somehow becoming a coward or falling under suspicion of cowardice by performing too many acts of courage and becoming too pleased with himself on that account. In other words, humility is a uniquely anti-reflexive virtue. By this I mean that it is by its very nature resistant to self-evaluation and self-appreciation, not to mention self-scoring. And the minute one begins to undertake those judgments, one has fatally violated the ground rules and undone the whole effort. There's a kind of Heisenberg principle at work, meaning that while one can make judgments about the humility of others, there is no mirror into which one can gaze to discover the uncomplicated truth about one's own progress in humility. Small wonder that so many religious and philosophical traditions, and particularly ours, understand humility as a process of self-emptying and self-forgetting, a rigorous discipline that involves a relentless training of one's eyes and the eyes of one's soul upon things outside oneself. Most of us in everyday life don't do this, and we sometimes have trouble with the principles involved. I think, for example, of a Sunday school teacher that my son had, about which he came home once complaining bitterly that after teaching students about the doctrine of total depravity, she reassured one of the upset girls in the class who really was having a hard time thinking of herself and her mom as totally depraved. The Sunday school teacher said, "Oh, no, don't worry, Carrie. That doesn't mean you're a bad person." But I know what she meant. And I know that there's some way in which teaching children these principles apart from a kind of experience of life that would make them meaningful can be counterproductive. This teacher was trying to stick up for virtue, for the value of everyday goodness and decency, for the resiliency of those everyday virtues. And who can blame her for doing so? But still, my point here is that Christianity is not a schoolhouse of human virtue, so much as it is a melodrama of human redemption. And nothing's more important about it than the recognition of our insufficiency that it requires of us. Jesus came for the sick and not for the healthy. And the great stories of conversion are stories of a different kind of conviction, not the conviction we praise in a person of high virtue and virtuous character, but the conviction of sin, that stabbing, self-indicting realization that you have been wrong, irretrievably so. So much so that nothing you can do on your own, not even an immediate and complete amendment of life, can begin to redress the balance. Christian parents try to bring up their children to lives of virtue and conviction, and they're right to do so. That Sunday school teacher is not a bad person. Christian educators do much the same, and bravo and brava to them for that. But we should never forget that all this effort will not suffice, not in itself, because there's no short-circuiting the need for each of us to have his or her own convicting encounter with our frailty, our failings, our unrighteousness, our pitiable lack of virtue. We must acquire our knowledge of God's love in Christ separately, as individuals alone, in moments of interior illumination that cannot be passed on or induced by others or habituated into or manufactured for easy consumption. No one can do it for us, even though Christian parents and educators may want desperately to be able to do it for us. They and we must have the courage to know when to let go, stand back, trust, and pray, knowing that notwithstanding all that we know and all that we can prepare for, and that we rightly do prepare for and know, we live and move and have our being in the corridors and anterooms of a great mystery. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.